Welcome back to the show. We're going to be looking at more of the interesting questions in the state of the Confusion Union survey this year. And if you missed the last episode where we looked at 24 of those questions and had a lot of interesting info there on different things developers are doing, you can find that on the TerraTech blog. And coming up, we're going to be looking at how people are using mobile development. What is keeping people doing ColdFusion, or what is stopping them doing it in their companies, and caching solutions people are using, framework tools, monitoring tools, deployment methods people use, what the popular REST APIs are, and also what kind of salary range people have in the ColdFusion world. And we're also looking at some somewhat controversial questions on how people are locking down their servers and how many of us admit to being hacked in the last few years. So, and how that happened.
Sounds
So,
intriguing.
and then also, it is intriguing. Yes, that's coming up in this episode. And then also, we're going to look at online ColdFusion communities where you can meet other CF developers and get your questions answered, and which are the most popular, and how you spend your time hobby versus professional coding. And also, we're going to have a look at some of the comments people made. Lots of comments were made on this survey, and there's some controversial things being said in there that we'll get to.
That's my
So
favorite part.
I'm here with Brad Wood. Absolutely. I'm here with Brad Wood from Autist Solutions. He's the evangelist for the whole box line of products. I
Thanks
think
for having me, Michael.
Yeah, absolutely, every time. And just so you know, Brad helped out with improving the questions on this survey and analyzing the results. So he's a great all-round guy. You can meet him at the upcoming Into the Box conference that's coming up real soon now.
Very nice
So,
plug.
yeah. So, well, I like to plug it just because it's like, helping keep ColdFusion alive. It's the modern face of ColdFusion, if I'm saying that right.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, you should trademark it or something. So let me share the screen so we can have a look at the first question on mobile development. And here it comes. So what kind of mobile development frameworks are developers using? And of course, the number one answer is they're just not doing mobile development.
Yeah, it's actually, I guess maybe it's not too surprising. I kind of thought more people would be doing mobile dev. I'm kind of curious if this is a reflection more of the companies that are represented by the survey.
Yeah, maybe, or I don't know that. I mean, first of all, people taking the survey tend to be the people more active in online forums, uh, or on the TerraTech email list, or maybe are follow people on Twitter. And I think a lot of ColdFusion developers just do their 9 to 5 job and don't really spend time on forums. So
Yeah,
I
I'm honestly a
I
little
was.
surprised at just the amount of people
Mhm.
still doing native iOS and native Android. Maybe this is just a personal thing. I would never really consider that in favor of, some of the cross-platform solutions like PhoneGap, pretty much any other solution that's not native. But I suppose maybe a lot of companies are willing to, give the giant, proverbial middle finger to all Android users and say we're only supporting iOS. I wouldn't think that many people would be doing that these days. But I did want to also
What would the point be? You just have, I mean, first of all, the same number of people are pretty much doing native iOS as native Android, which, we don't know for sure, but it kind of suggests that they're doing both.
It's possible. It seems like a lot more work. Given they could write their app once with one of these sort of cross-platform ones. I wanted to point out in the responses, it looks like next year we definitely need to add Xamarin as well as React Native. We had a lot of write-ins for both of those.
Mm-hmm.
So that's good to know. Now the other group is still only maybe 10%, but it looked like a fair number of those were using Xamarin and React Native.
Yeah. And the most popular one is PhoneGap. Do any of these your personal favorites or
CF Client, Michael.
CF Client?
Of
Okay.
course, CF Client, of course, was just a wrapper around PhoneGap. But I don't find that very surprising. I think it's kind of one of the biggest ones. I would say PhoneGap probably personally, but I have yet to do very much mobile development at all. So at Ortus, we are doing some, but I haven't been personally involved in it.
Cool. So let's go on and look at question 26. What aspects of ColdFusion are keeping you or your company using it? And here we get into some interesting stuff.
Yes, we do. So I think the biggest one by far, I think, is rapid development, followed by prior investment in ColdFusion, which is interesting. Prior investment in CF is too large to rewrite. Is the next one.
Yeah, and that's going to work for any language that's been around for a while.
We have fast to learn, easy to integrate, less code.
Yeah, a lot of people have mentioned that to me when I've talked to them, that, you know, they just can write, they know plenty of other languages, but they can do it a lot quicker in ColdFusion.
Sure, yeah.
And even fun to code in is pretty popular too, which, you know, we don't always rate that as when we pick a coding language, but like if something is tedious to code in, you know, do you really want to be doing it?
I think in reality that is a large draw, especially for people who pick up language in their free time. If it's not something that's, you know, fun and to write in, they're probably not going to keep doing it.
And then
comments here.
And then a fair number of people put good performance, and actually that's surprisingly true because, you know, in the ColdFusion engine inside the server, there's a lot of tweaking around that gets multi-threading and other stuff that gets a lot of throughput to go through a site. So
yeah, and I don't find it too surprising. You know, personally, the JVM has been well proven as a platform that scales, you know, exceptionally well. You know, Twitter, you know, had a big write-up when they switched from Ruby on Rails to the JVM in Java. You know, they were able to have a lot fewer servers and support a lot higher traffic. And so, I mean, that's why I always tell people ColdFusion is a JVM-based language. Because I mean, the JVM, in my opinion, is already a good thing as far as deployment and speed.
well, and there's many different versions of the Java virtual machine that are made, so you know it's going to be around for decades.
I like the built-in features as well. I think that's one of the things I tend to talk about when I talk to non-ColdFusion programmers.
Yep.
You know, I talk about the fact that, you know, CFML is a platform that comes out of the box with just a whole slew of integration and you know, things that are packaged in. So I personally like that one. In fact, I think I probably voted for it when I took the survey.
Yeah, and you know, you can write the same thing in PHP or .NET or whatever, but you're probably going to end up adding third-party libraries in. And if anyone who's added a third-party library, you're kind of rolling the dice as to whether it's going to work out immediately, or you're going to have to tweak around with it, or it's the compatibility issues. So it's certainly a big help when things are built in.
Sure, yeah, and ColdFusion, you know, incorporates a large number of open source Java libraries, but they've gone through the effort to make sure they're all going to work cohesively together. You don't have to worry about that, which is a good thing.
And then works with many different databases is what I believe this one is, which, you know, some people need to move around between databases, and that's certainly a good thing. And then also that, you know, you can run it open source. You know, you can run with Lucy, CFML, and you can set up a whole stack that's completely open source using ColdFusion.
Yeah, and that's actually a fairly good number. You know, 33% of respondents saying that, you know, open source engines, which effectively I think are going to be, you know, mostly Lucy, to a much lesser extent Rilo, and to an incredibly small percent OpenBlue Dragon, you know, are essentially what's helping keep them on the platform. I think that speaks well to those, because those are all potentially people that may have moved on if they didn't have those open source offerings available to them.
Yeah. So here we've got 12 or more really good reasons to keep on using ColdFusion. Great to see that, and thanks for the suggestion that someone made last year to have this question in the survey.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the opposite side of the coin, the dark side. What aspects, yes, we come to the dark side. What aspects of ColdFusion are preventing you or your company from embracing ColdFusion, which is question 27 in the survey?
Yeah, so I mean, the biggest one by far is seen as dying in legacy, which is sad because that's really completely perception. You know, it's not a fault of the language itself, or, you know, what you can build with it. It's really just a giant perception issue. I think that's what drives a lot of the, CAO, CTO, types away. Who'll come in and think, let's use .NET, right? That's, nobody got fired for, buying Microsoft, as the saying goes.
Hmm.
I think that's one of the biggest issues that we need to try to fix as a community is just the perception of ColdFusion.
Yeah, absolutely. And as the answer says, it's seen as dying or legacy. It's not that it actually has died,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and it's not that it, I don't know quite what the word legacy means, whether it just means the code been around for a while or what. But, I see some really modern and exciting things happening in ColdFusion code. And I know in, the conference you're speaking at, there's a lot of modern ColdFusion coding techniques that people are doing. So it's cutting edge. But we need to get the word out there that yes, it is alive and it can be modern code. I mean, sure,
absolutely.
you can write old style code in it, and you may be maintaining mountains of old style code if you're lucky. Um,
Sure. Well, I mean, I run across people that are already ColdFusion developers who aren't aware of the tooling and resources available. Imagine that issue amplified even more in the communities of people who aren't even doing ColdFusion. I think there's a lot of
mhm.
misconception on what modern
Oh,
HTML looks
yeah.
like.
Well, and I think sometimes, I've seen people in other, Java or PHP communities who they're talking about ColdFusion 5 and not ColdFusion 2016 or Lucy 5, and they make all these accusations that are kind of straw man arguments that aren't even true.
Yeah. So here's actually a response. Here's a write-in response on this question. Lack of command line sucks. So here's the irony. Command Box, which is precisely that, a command line tool for ColdFusion, has been around for 3 years now. And here's a member of the ColdFusion community who literally is 3 years or more behind. They've had a command line for 3 years and they apparently don't even know it.
And what is the cost of command box? For
Uh,
those who don't know.
it is absolutely free, Michael.
Exactly. So there should be no reason to be not using that. So you can get the benefits of spinning up servers and different versions of ColdFusion,
Yeah.
and all the other command line things you can do. And I was talking with Gert the other day, who's part of the Lucy initiative, and they're working on in the next dot release speeding up how quickly it loads,
Mm-hmm.
so that when you use it command line, it can do it twice as fast. As
Exactly.
before.
Yeah. When you run a command from the command line, there's a little bit of loading in the background. So
Yeah.
the next biggest thing, difficulty of finding CF developers, which is interesting because we have both sides of that coin. We have difficult to find CF work and difficult to find CF developers, and both of those have a decent amount of votes. But it looks like there's more people looking for developers, which I mean
Hmm.
that's good for developers, right? That means that's a hiring market.
Yeah.
And we talked about this last time, I think, how a lot of people I think need to stop looking for developers, stop limiting their searches to only applicants who already know ColdFusion, but to look for qualified developers that know a similar scripting language, Ruby, Java, .NET, PHP, and simply train them on the specifics of ColdFusion. I think they'd be able to fill a lot more seats that way. But that's interesting to know that that's a big issue, and I've heard the same thing from clients of mine as well.
Well, and also don't limit your search to people who happen to live in the same town that you're based in. You
True.
know,
Yeah, there's a lot of remote availability, people that would work remotely, but it's not always an option.
yeah.
And so unfixed bugs is sort of the next biggest one, which is kind of interesting. I know that can be personally frustrating when you've submitted a bug, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and it's still sitting around a bug tracker. I think there's two prongs for that. We don't know if the people who answered that were referring to the Adobe bug base or the Lucy bug base. Obviously, there's nothing that you or I can do to fix Adobe bugs other than voting and commenting and pointing them out. I think it's worth pointing out that if there are unfixed bugs in Lucy server, at least that's something the community has the ability to to fix on their own terms, to be able to submit pull requests and things. So at least there's there's reprieve available for people using the open source engines. They have the ability to help contribute in that area.
Yeah, and lobby directly to the people who might be able to help. If you have a
Yeah.
relationship with some of the people who do the committing to that code base, you can convince them why it's important
So,
to fix it, and you can help with debugging it to make it
mhm.
easy for the fix to happen.
So
Even if
on this topic, it's probably worth talking about how people can push for bugs to be fixed.
Mhm.
So for Lucy specifically, um, the product manager now is Patrick Quinn of WebApper. He's been pushing us for monthly sprints inside of Lucy, and so he starts a thread on our discourse forum, which by the way is where we just move our Google Groups to discourse. And if there's bugs that you want to see fixed, he does look to see what votes are on bugs. So that's important, but also pointing that out in the discourse forum and tagging him and saying, can this be part of an upcoming sprint, is a way to get something kind of flagged for Lucy. For Adobe,
Right.
for
So
Adobe, they
and just to encourage people there, it helps if you explain why this would benefit other people and not just yourself.
sure,
Why it's an important bug to fix. And then the other thing is, if you have other friends who are having issues with the same bug, get them to comment too. Do a little grassroots outreach and get some encouragement. If you have several people saying, yeah, let's fix this, here's why, it's far more
absolutely,
likely to get
yeah.
fixed. The
Every
squeaky
once in a
wheel
while,
gets
I'll
fixed.
see somebody say, why has this bug have not been fixed for either Adobe or Lucy? And I'll look and I'll say, well, there's 0 tickets. There's 0 votes on the bug,
Mhm.
right? So for starters, find some people to vote on it, right? And
Yeah.
so the equivalent for Adobe, they do have voting on their bug tracker. I only assume they look at it since I'm not as involved in their process. I'm not sure. But for people who aren't on the CFML Slack team, there's an Adobe channel in there, and Anit Kumar Panda is in there, and a lot of people come on and they'll tag him and say, hey, can you follow up and see if there's a status on this bug? And so that's a good way if you have a ticket in the Adobe bug base to kind of get a push in that area. Obviously, they can't fix everything all the time, but I think those are kind of 2 good things that people can follow if they have bugs in either engine that they'd like to kind of light a fire under.
Yeah, those are great suggestions. And I just want to appreciate both Adobe and Lucy for having public bug databases because, well, I think Lucy's always had one, but as did
Yeah,
Rilo.
but Adobe.
Adobe didn't used to have this, and they started it, I think, 10 years ago, I want to say, maybe 8 or 9. After we started that CF Bug Hunt site when the wonderful ColdFusion MX, i.e. ColdFusion 6 came out and was slightly
Yeah,
buggy, if you remember
yeah.
ColdFusion 6.
I do remember ColdFusion 6.
Yeah, which was a shame because ColdFusion 5 was incredibly reliable. Damon Cooper at Adobe, when he was still there, he had this thorough, QA process. And I think that's been recreated at Adobe, where whenever someone reported a bug, they asked them for a copy of their code, and then they'd stick that in their code repository so that, like a new version of ColdFusion would get run through the same code that had bugs before, so they wouldn't, come back as zombie bugs, right? So
Yes.
lots of good stuff. All right, should we move forward
Yes,
to the
let's go ahead.
next question? So question 28, what caching solutions are people using? So number 1 caching solution, cache. Of course, that comes built in.
Yeah, and to an extent, the Rilo Lucy cache is sort of the same answer. By default, so I guess it's important to note that Adobe ColdFusion has cache built in for like the CF cache tags, the cache get, cache put functions. Lucy and Rilo have a bit more built onto that. They kind of have a caching mechanism where you can create multiple named caches that point to some sort of internal or external data store. So Rilo and Lucy offer to you cache as well as Adobe ColdFusion built in, and they also have a RAM cache option, which just stores it in memory in the heap. So I guess it's not surprising to see that both of those options are sort of by and large the most common use, since they require 0 additional effort. They just kind of come out of the box.
And that's on Lucy, this cache external, I guess, is what you're talking about.
No, Lucy server has built-in cache in the same manner that Adobe ColdFusion does, out of the box, right? Now, Cachebox, of course, well, I was going to say it's not a caching implementation of its own, but actually it is. It does support an in-memory cache. The Cachebox, in a similar fashion that Rilo and Lucy are, is also an aggregator that allows you to connect to external cache stores. So people using Cachebox could quite possibly be connecting to Memcached or to Couchbase or to, a JDBC store. Obviously, we can't tell from that, but it's interesting to see the breakdown here.
And just for people, people who aren't doing caching, which seems to be about half the people who took this survey, perhaps, so it's multiple choice, so maybe that's a deceptive number. But what kind of things would you want to cache in your application, and what kind of effects might you expect to see?
Yeah, so I mean, caching is kind of one of the go-to patterns and strategies when you're dealing with, high availability and you're trying to work on performance, especially with, some sort of distributed system. And so a couple quick and easy examples, we use caching on the Order Solutions blog, for instance, to cache both user sessions. So if you're, visiting the site, logged in or not, as well as just the HTML content of the blog posts, it's things that change very infrequently, but it's accessed often. So a typical caching strategy that we'll use on our servers is we'll have, a Couchbase cluster sitting behind either, Cachebox or just Lucy's cache aggregator. And we'll be, caching the HTML of the blog post inside of that. And having an external cache can be nice. External meaning not in your server's RAM, which would be an in-process cache. Having an out-of-process cache is nice because if you restart a server, you don't have to wait for those caches to warm up again. We can bounce the server when Lucy comes back up or ColdFusion comes back up. It's still pulling, hits in the cache mechanism since that's stored out of process.
Right. And then, of course, you can also cache queries as well. And
that's some really nice built-in functionality. So yeah, Adobe ColdFusion will only let you cache queries in the built-in EH cache. Lucy, Rilo will let you point your query cache to any external cache you want. So you can cache queries in Couchbase or in Memcached.
And I hadn't played with Couchbase as a caching solution.
Yeah.
I thought it was kind of distributed database kind of thing.
It is. Couchbase is sort of a marriage between Memcached and CouchDB. And we're
Are they going to have children?
They did. It was called Couchbase.
Oh, okay.
Originally it was called Membase, and they renamed it to Couchbase. We're big fans of that at Ortus. We use it for a lot of our stuff, and it combines both a NoSQL data store, including an actual SQL-like querying language. So you can cache JSON documents, but it also works as just a typical key value cache. You can throw binary blobs in it. You can cache HTML, just text.
But it's a little bit like a CDN, it's spread out over several servers, probably geographically spread out.
Yes, it supports all that. You can have as many nodes in a Couchbase cluster. You can have cross data center replication. That's why we like it, because it's incredibly fault tolerant in its mechanisms.
And I just want to encourage people who want to speed up their apps, start off by looking at the SQL. As Bill Clinton might have said, it's the SQL stupid.
Well, I would also like to point out while we're here, Cachebox does end in box, but that's not a requirement to use ColdBox with it. Cachebox is something that comes along with ColdBox, but it's a standalone library. So if you have a legacy application or FuseBox Framework 1 and you want to drop in some caching, you can always drop in Cachebox all by itself for sure.
Cool. Well, here's the faster apps. Let's move on to question 29 on what miscellaneous frameworks are you using? And I just can't help but notice in this answer that every other answer ends in box. So, but the number one miscellaneous framework is CommandBox, which is completely free. And
Yes.
Why would someone want to use that?
I'm glad you asked, Michael. If anybody doesn't know, I am the lead developer for CommandBox, so it warms my heart to see good uptake on that. CommandBox is a CLI tool, so it's a REPL, lets you kind of run ColdFusion directly from the command line. You can execute CFM files from a cron job or as a shebang script, but it also does package management. You can install libraries, you can install frameworks, and you can, most importantly, start servers. So it can start Lucy servers, it can start Adobe servers, any version.
So you could have like 4 different server versions, Adobe ColdFusion 11, Lucy 5, Lucy 4.
Exactly. All running
Adobe
at the same time.
2016.
Yep.
And you
Takes
could
care.
just spin them up
Mhm.
anytime
Yep.
and you
Takes
wouldn't.
care of the ports so nothing conflicts. We actually use command box in all of our Travis CI builds now, so we can test our frameworks like ColdBox against Lucy 4, Lucy 5, ColdFusion 10, ColdFusion 11, ColdFusion 2016, and it's all just based on command box. You just say,
Mm.
start the server and it boots it up. So,
All
and
right. And then,
that's actually when we saw command box usage really jump a lot, is when we added in the ability to start Adobe servers. I think a lot of
yeah.
people are using that now as an alternative to actually installing, a specific version of ColdFusion, which is great.
And then Logbox, the second most used one by 27% of folks. Why would someone want to use that over just using CF Log?
Yeah, so like Cachebox, Logbox is something that is part of the ColdBox family, but it's a standalone framework, so you can use it in any application you want, even if you're not using ColdBox MVC. But Logbox lets you do similar to CF Log, but just much more flexible. You can, have a generic concept of I have a log message of this severity, and it can go to a text file, it can go to a database, it can go to an email, it can go to a Twitter feed. You can kind of dynamically at runtime provision where you want these log messages to be logged to, and that can be different per environment. So on dev you can say dump all log messages of any kind into a text file that gets zipped up every 10 megabytes, and then production maybe you have different settings for it. It can be very handy, especially if you're dealing with any kind of containerized deployment of your apps. Docker containers or things where you had these, there's no static file system underneath them. So it's important to be able to log your error messages outside. We have some custom appenders written for things like BugLog HQ. So we can have our servers all via Logbox logging any error messages on the site to some centralized BugLog HQ server. So it comes in very handy for situations like that.
Cool. And then next down here is FuseGuard. Why would someone want to use that?
Now, I wish more people were using FuseGuard. This is a product of Pete Freitag's from Foundio, and it's excellent. It's basically a web application firewall that's written in ColdFusion, and it will actually block a large number of known hack attempts
Mm-hmm.
from being able to hit your website. So if someone tries
Mm-hmm.
to exploit a vulnerable SQL statement with SQL injection, or
Mm-hmm.
exploit path transversal, exploits, this product of Pete's, which is a commercial product but it's very well worth it, will actually
Mm-hmm.
detect those via some configurable heuristics, and it'll block those requests and even log them. So we've played
Yeah, I
around with that.
definitely recommend doing something there. Either clean up your code to fix the holes, or use something like this. I mean, I guess this is similar to .NET. Is it .NET Defender? No, there's something that's like a generic version of this kind of thing, but this is called Fusion Pacific.
It's possible.
Yeah.
I think it's a fantastic product. Pete's really done a good job with that one, so I think more
Yeah.
people should check into it.
He's Mr.
Also,
Security.
on that note, if you're curious about your servers, Pete, the author of FuseGuard, also has a
Yep.
hackmycf.com website, which is a very cheap subscription you can pay, and it'll actually email you and tell you if you have any vulnerabilities in your website. It's a non-intrusive scanning that it does, and it'll alert you preemptively. You're behind on your updates. You need to lock down this directory. It'll scare
Yeah,
you.
that's a great tool, and it'll alert you if there's a patch being put out by Adobe. Just to be clear, that's just looking at the server side of things. It isn't checking code or
Yeah.
stuff, whereas FuseGuard is actually protecting some holes you might have in your code. And we have a question a little bit further down where people admit to how much they've been hacked. So we'll look at that a bit later. And then two other tools here, miscellaneous frameworks, DocBox and ForgeBox. So just briefly,
Yeah.
why would someone want either of those?
So very quickly, DocBox is the Ortus fork of the ColdDoc project, which I believe was Mark Mandel. It was no longer being maintained, so we kind of took it under our wing and rebranded it. But it allows you to generate HTML documentation of your CFCs. So we use that for all, the ColdBox, TestBox, all of our internal libraries. We have API docs you can use. We use DocBox to generate those. And ForgeBox is less of a tool, and it's actually a website. The forgebox.io website is where you host packages that you can install from command boxes, kind of part of our ecosystem. but it's not a requirement that it's, ColdBox specific. Anybody, if you have a library for, creating ASCII art, whatever you want, you can put it on ForgeBox.
And there were a lot of writing entries here of other tools people use. Any interesting ones you noticed? Or?
Let me take a quick check. Refresh my memory.
Let's see what comes up here.
I'd say a lot of these didn't belong in this category.
Test box.
Where they typed none.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Maybe we need a none in here for next year.
I like this. Command box deserves 2 because it's so awesome. I promise I didn't type that.
I believe you. So I think the takeaway from me on this is if you're not using some of these toolkits, some of which are free, some of which are paid, you're probably missing out, and worth checking out some of them. So let's move on to monitoring. Of course, none of us have slow or crashing ColdFusion servers, right?
Nope, not me.
No. But question 30 here, what monitoring tools are you using? And the number one tool is Fusion Reactor, which maybe is no surprise because it's the one that gets the best maintenance and new features.
Yeah, Fusion Reactor is very active. They have releases every month, probably. Maybe not quite that often, but I know they're always coming out with new releases.
And they're also very supportive of the ColdFusion community. I know they're sponsors of CF Camp and Into the Box, and I think they were sponsor of ND DevCon.
NC DevCon.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. The Fusion Reactor guys put a lot of effort into reaching out to the ColdFusion community.
Yeah.
It's worth noting, CFusion has not very many votes. It is a product that kind of gone stale for a while. That's managed by WebApper.
Yep. Used to be a great product and still is okay, but it just hasn't been getting updates.
Yeah, well, they have recently released CFusion 5, which I thought I'd point out, which involves a lot of kind of cloud-based management and pricing. So it'll be interesting to see if CFusion picks up any usage, just kind of based on the fact that they're starting to push out some new versions of that.
Yeah, I've got a podcast interview with David Tattersall, who's the CEO of Integral, coming up in a few weeks, and apparently they've got a cloud-based version of Fusion Reactor. And
they do. It'll push the metrics from your website to a cloud location where you can view them externally, which is actually pretty cool.
Yeah. So, and they've also got lots of other cool features like they can automatically restart the server. They can tell you when it's getting close to a memory limit or disk limit or whatever limits you put in. There's all kinds of cool things in there. And it also can help you debug. If you've got something slow or crashing, it can help you identify the slow SQL or the slow ColdFusion files.
Yeah, and I am a little disappointed to see almost 20% of people saying they don't monitor their servers at all. Now, I don't know if it means that they don't personally monitor it, and someone in the IT department does, but, hopefully...
I think I'm going to interpret that they don't. We need to rephrase the question. We don't use monitoring software, tools, or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people
do that next year.
Will come on the mailing list or such, and they'll say, I've got a page and it takes 10 minutes to run and I don't know why, or it crashes my server. And we'll ask, well, do you have Fusion Reactor or CFusion or something installed? And the answer is no. And the fact of the matter is that they've wasted, far more, of their company's resources in their time than it would have taken just to purchase, a product like this. And even, the ColdFusion Server Monitor, if you've got ColdFusion Enterprise, you already have a monitor that's not nearly as well featured as Fusion Reactor, but it'll at least get you things like stack traces, memory usage out of the box. But I think a lot of people just don't, I don't know if they're not sure how to use these tools or just, don't take the time, but I think everybody should have some kind of, monitoring solution under their belt that they can use to see what their code is doing.
Yeah, I'd recommend that. And now that Fusion Reactor's gone to a monthly subscription pricing as well as just being able to purchase the software, I think their lowest price thing's like, I want to say $39 a month, which is, you try getting a cup of coffee every day for $1 something a day,
Do that. Well, see, Fusion Reactor also has a developer license if you're going to only use it for your developer workstation, not on a production web server. And I think it's $200. I think it's $199 a year, which is much cheaper than their typical pricing as well.
Yeah, I think their regular thing's about $1,500 or something like that.
Yeah, so there's a lot of options, in my opinion. They're well worth the time you're going to spend.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's move forward. Question 31. What kind of deployments are folks doing? You know, lots of tools people could use on deployments. Most popular one is deploying in-house.
Yeah.
And second one is on managed servers. So those are where the deployment's going to, which is a slightly different question, right? But this is a multi-choice question. So
Yeah.
and shared hosting was kind of behind on that. So
It should be. It needs to die in a fire.
why is that, Brad, in your
Uh,
opinion?
I always hated
I,
shared hosting because you're sharing a server, right, with, other websites, and they've usually got the security locked down, to where it's nearly unusable, or the security isn't locked down, which means that, you're not very well, separated from the other servers. Um,
yeah, I
it's
mean, to put this in a metaphor, shared hosting is sort of like you're going to a youth hostel dormitory and you're with all the other people. And if someone gets drunk and throws up on the bunk bed, you're screwed. And then managed servers more like an apartment
yeah.
complex, where there are other apartments, but they're kind of firewalled off from each other. Um, whether that's virtual private server or a dedicated machine. I
Well, we
guess
have
dedicated
VPS.
machine
We
would
have
be like you
VPS on
built your
here.
own house. So
Yes, I mean,
we
we
have,
have VPS on here. So a VPS is somebody manages the hardware, but you install everything you want, including ColdFusion.
yeah.
Managed,
So that's like having an apartment complex and you have a separate apartment, and then
but
the
but
managed
you have to
servers like yeah you
VPS is like you have to furnish your apartment and fix the faucet when it leaks.
right. Whereas managed server is you've built your own house or the ISP built one for you, and it's totally separate from anyone else.
I like this. We need just to run this analogy out until it breaks. I am.
Um, yes, Trump tire would be no way. I can't quite come up with an analogy of that.
I
But
don't know.
let's move on to the other deployment question, which is: do you use some software to do your deployments? And I think the number one solution there is Docker. So tell us why someone would want to use Docker.
Well, see, I think Docker isn't necessarily mutually exclusive with a number of these. For instance, Kubernetes is more of an orchestration layer on top of Docker. In fact, Heroku and Doku are even sort of layers on top of Docker as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Docker is very attractive, and what I see right now in the cloud world is everything is trending towards Docker in some form or another. I actually, we just had a call today with the guys at Cloud Foundry, managed by Pivotal, just to kind of look at um, some of their offerings, and their stuff is heavily based around a lot of Docker options. But it's the idea that you can, kind of completely separate the server that you're installing your code onto,
Mm-hmm.
from the application itself. So you have this little precious snowflake of an application that you bundle up in this nice little package, and you can just say deploy 10 of these. And some of the orchestration layers on top of Docker are very convincing, to be able to say, if the load of my application reaches a certain threshold, deploy 2 more servers with automatic load balancing between them. That gives a level of flexibility that's unheard of in the on-house category. In my opinion, my personal opinion, I think this question right here is where the ColdFusion space has some of the most to grow in the future. I think the ColdFusion is really lagging behind in this area of deployments. If you were to look at the same question in other major languages like Ruby or or Node, um, Grails, I think a lot of those communities would much less favor in-house, but instead they would be doing things like Heroku. They would be doing things like Docker-based, deployments, Kubernetes. Though I think to a degree, maybe some of the ColdFusion shops that are government, that have very tight restrictions on where they're allowed to run. Quite possibly, a lot of these just aren't options for them, based on the
Well,
red tape.
couldn't they go onto a private cloud that they control?
They could, and I guess maybe that's what they mean by in-house. They would probably have to be a
No,
bit more
I'm pretty
advanced.
sure. I'm pretty sure in-house means they actually have the hardware in a room in the office
Sure. I mean,
building.
is a lot of these like Kubernetes, right? Kubernetes is available, via just a hosted solution, Google Cloud Services. You can also
Mhm.
run your own, Kubernetes clusters effectively in-house. Though I don't know, I don't think nearly as many people are doing that. Um,
And then Vagrant is a similar idea to Docker, but why? And
yeah.
that's pretty
So
popular. So,
Vagrant can have provisioners that would point to any kind of, cloud service like Rackspace and things like that. But 99% of everybody that I know using Vagrant are using it specifically for local development. Vagrant is for provisioning virtual machines, VMs, right? And Docker is for provisioning containers. And so a container is much more lightweight than an entire virtual machine. It's faster to provision. Typing Vagrant up from scratch might take 15 minutes. Bringing up a Docker instance might take 30 seconds. So I see Docker as the next logical evolution of Vagrant. In fact, when you install Docker today on a Windows machine, it actually installs VirtualBox and deploys a single virtual machine to it that then the Docker containers run inside of. So I think Vagrant is still very compelling for local development, but I think it's being overtaken by Docker.
And when you say container, for people who don't quite know what that means, why would you want a container to run your ColdFusion in?
Right. So a virtual machine, like what Vagrant creates for you by default on a tool like VirtualBox, is a full installation of an operating system that's booted up from scratch on virtual hardware, right? So you assign RAM to it, you assign CPUs to it, you boot all the way from, virtualized BIOS up to, a Linux installation. Docker, when we say process, it's literally just a process running inside of a Linux operating system, or I think the latest versions of Windows 10 support this natively. So when you spin up a new Docker container, you just have a base Linux operating system running, and it's literally just a matter of saying spawn this new process. And inside of that is a little encapsulated Linux thing that's running, and it thinks it's its own machine, but it's really just one of many processes running on a base hardware. So your density is much higher. The number of containers you can spin up, the time to spin them up is just a matter of seconds, because you're not booting a full operating system from scratch. You're just saying, here's an existing running OS, spin me off a new process. But yeah, it's a very kind of technical answer, but there's a lot of benefits to the container based, in that it's just a process running on a base operating system. It's still very segregated system resource wise, but it's a lot more lightweight and faster than a full VM like Vagrant gives you.
So it could keep your applications separate from each other. If you've got a development server, you could have different containers that had different versions of ColdFusion or different databases or whatever you were testing.
Sure, yeah, there's base containers for everything imaginable. In fact, we have command box based containers that you can just say, I want to run Adobe ColdFusion 11, and that's what it spins up. And the idea with a container based approach is you have a container for each application, just little separate deployable apps.
And the other thing is, once you've configured the container, you can save it off to disk, and then when you want to bring it back to life, you can just spin it up very quickly.
Yeah. So I expect to see Docker growing in the future, and things like Kubernetes, Azure, EC2. I expect to see those all growing. At least I would like to see them grow. I would like to see the in-house bar get smaller as those get larger, because I think that really unlocks a new potential for people to scale applications that they just don't have in-house. Most people in-house, if you said, how long would it take you to put another web server online starting today, they might tell you 2 weeks, right? Anybody using Kubernetes, you say, how long would it take you to put another web server online? And they'd be like, I just did it. It's there, in production right now. It's a different world of deployment for sure.
And let's just talk a little bit about these different cloud servers, Amazon EC2 or Azure.
Yeah, and so EC2 is the only cloud deployment option that's really natively supported by Adobe right now. They've promised us Docker containers, though I haven't seen it. I spoke with Alicia recently. I think she said they were working on them. EC2 is one of the only deployment options that really gives Adobe the ability to collect the pricing, because you pay per hour for your ColdFusion license and what they're doing. A lot of these options don't quite have the same control that EC2 does to be able to, charge the customer, per hour, per instance.
And if you wanted to use Amazon, you also could run Lucy on it, I assume.
Absolutely, yeah. Web appers worked on making gold certified AMIs for EC2. Lucy also has Heroku build packs. They have, base Docker images you can build on. Obviously, with the licensing out of the picture, you don't have to worry nearly as much about your deployment, licensing with Lucy as you do with Adobe ColdFusion.
Right. Though you would be paying by the hour to Amazon just for the server
Sure,
instances.
and I will add, I know that Adobe's working on some better cloud-based licensing. I was with some of the Adobe team members a few weeks ago, and I asked them about that, and they acknowledged that that's something the current EULA is sort of vague on, and it's something they're working on doing, because Adobe wants to be able to free people up to use these cloud offerings easier. The trick is that how do they know how much to charge you unless, especially things like Kubernetes, where the number of containers can just be spooling up and down throughout the day based on your site's usage. I mean, what the heck do you charge people for? I mean, how do you
just take the average? I mean,
well,
right?
yeah, there's a lot of ways to handle it. So that's what I think they're
Yeah.
working through with their legal team inside of Adobe, is
I was
figuring
going
out
to
how to.
say, I'm sure from the technical mathematical point of view, it would be pretty easy to come up with a fair answer. But as soon as you bring in the lawyers, they probably have to contemplate it for a while.
Sure.
So
So
let's move on,
yeah,
shall
that's my
we?
graph I want to keep my eyes on for next year. I want to see how it's
Yeah.
changing. Sure.
Yeah. So question 32, what do you use to build REST APIs? So a lot of different things here. Number one is homegrown. And number
Yeah.
two is we don't use REST.
I'm not incredibly surprised that there's a decent number of people not using REST, but I am disappointed to see how many people have grown their own. Most of the major frameworks all have, a REST implementation, with Taffy, Coldbox Framework 1. And so it's kind of disappointing to think of the hours people have spent writing their own ability to do that, when there's these off-the-shelf, frameworks that probably could have saved them a large amount of time. I mean, even the CF built-in REST, which is generally regarded as not being that good, at least has decent usage, but it's not as many as the homegrown ones, which is a little surprising.
And just for those who aren't using REST, why would you want to use expose a REST API in your app? What's the benefit of that?
It used to be the biggest reason people would write a REST API is when they wanted to integrate with a third party, some external company that wanted to be able to hit their services. But nowadays, with the days of the Angular front ends and the Vue.js front ends and just the single page apps, more and more commonly, people use a REST API just for their own website. They build kind of a ColdFusion based REST backend that just serves up JSON. In sort of a stateless manner. Then they have a JavaScript front end that's consuming that. I find that to be as common of a scenario, and as well for mobile. You want to be able to have a mobile app just using the same sort of data. You can back it with that REST API.
Yeah, so it's a way to isolate different parts of your code from each other, so you could swap out the front end and keep the back end the same. Or as you said, talk to third parties.
Yeah, but it looks from the right ends that even CF Wheels and Preside CMS and Far Cry, I think, all have some little custom REST stuff of their own as well. So pretty much everybody's using some kind of REST tooling, and chances are it does a lot more than something you're going to write on your own.
Yeah, just to let folks know, if you go to the survey online, if you just click on the extra responses, you can view all the write-in answers and comments. So moving on from REST to question 33, what deployment build tools do you use?
Yeah, and these aren't mutually exclusive either. In fact, most people using Jenkins are probably using Ant inside of Jenkins, or even for Travis. There's a lot. See, what's our percentage not using is about 45%. We use Jenkins for years. It's just a general build tool for all of our box products. When I make a commit to command box, there's a Jenkins build that kicks off and builds all the binaries and runs all the tests. But lately, we've been investing a lot into Travis CI, and one of the biggest, it has a very tight integration with GitHub. One of the best things with Travis, if you're an open source author, is when people send your product pull requests, as soon as they send the pull, a Travis CI build, which by the way is Docker based, it's a container that spins off in the cloud somewhere, right? I told you everything's using Docker these days. It'll spin up a container somewhere in the ether. It'll run all of your unit tests against the pull request that's being submitted to you. and it'll tell you right there in GitHub, you know, test have passed or test have failed, which is great because it gives you instant feedback. And so as an open source author, you know, I really appreciate that. Someone sends me a pull request and I can tell them right away, well, you broke the build, you know, come back and talk to me once the tests are passing, which is really great.
So the thing, for just to back up a moment, if people aren't using build tools, which 44% of people taking the survey said that, and I've got to believe people who didn't take the survey, it's probably even larger number, they're missing out on getting a reliable build made automatically, where every time you make a change to your code, it can run unit tests, it can, you know, deploy it to different servers depending on how you've got the thing set up.
I think this is actually in the, is it Jeff Atwood? He had like 12 questions that every, you know, applicant should ask a company, you know, is your company doing this before I accept the job? And one of them is, do you have can you create a build of your application with a single click? Chances are, if you're not using one of these, you'd probably have to answer no to that.
Yeah, and the reason you wouldn't want to do this manually is it's very error prone and it's easy to forget to copy a file or to miscopy things or get settings wrong. And then you have bugs to track down that can be quite hard to track down.
Yeah, when I started working with Luis and with ColdBox, every time a new version of ColdBox was released, Luis would just do it manually on his, you know, computer. This was years ago. And a lot of companies are the same way. You kind of have one guy who knows all the stuff that has to happen to get into production, you know. And if anybody else needs to do a build, they're kind of screwed. And so that's why we started using Jenkins internally, you know, with our products, is because I would say, how do I run a build? I don't have your computer in front of me, you know. And so now it's all completely detached and, you know, in a Jenkins job.
And it's now documented in that job scripting. So
exactly, and anybody can run a build. You know, if anybody wants to run build a command box, right? They can, you know, clone the repository, run, you know, an ant command.
And what is the cost on Jenkins? Just for people who don't know, and I might imagine it costs millions of dollars.
No, Jenkins, which is a fork of Hudson, is free. Travis CI is also free as long as your projects are open source. Ant is also free. It's an Apache product, right? And Ant is more, it's, you know, it's XML files you use to kind of describe what you want your build to do. So Ant is typically used inside of Travis or inside of Jenkins. Bamboo is the Atlassian equivalent to Jenkins, kind of, you know, ties in with the Atlassian tool set. I'm not actually sure the pricing on Bamboo, to be honest.
But the point I wanted to make was, if, you know, a lot of these options are open source or free.
There shouldn't be a pricing barrier for sure.
Right. And
Grunt and Gulp are all node-based. We actually use those, specifically Grunt, for a lot of our front-end builds. We have an Elixir project now with ColdBox that deals with things like, you know, your style sheet, you know, less than SAS compilations, your JavaScript minification, all that asset, you know, dealings that you do during a build. And so, you know, we use a lot of Grunt and Gulp, and of course there's no cost with that. Those are very popular. There's plugins for everything under the sun.
And then GitLab is a version of Git that has some of this stuff built in.
Yeah, it's sort of like a self-hosted GitHub repository that you can have, you know, behind a firewall on your own appliance. And it has its own kind of Jenkins-like automation built in. Jenkins lets you manually trigger builds or even schedule them. GitLab is, from my understanding, pretty much all just based on a commit that came in. So it's all based on the concept. You have a repository, somebody commits something to it, you know, and you run a pipeline.
Yeah. Yeah, I just did a podcast episode with George Murphy, who's speaking into the box, and he's focusing on, he could talk forever about the features of GitLab, and he talked for quite a while, which was very interesting because I learned some stuff I hadn't heard about before. So, well, let's before we move on, you know, sort of related to this is doing continuous integration, which a lot of these tools let you do. So why would someone want to do continuous integration?
Yeah, so I mean, the idea between continuous integration is all about closing that feedback loop between the amount of time that you write a line of code and the product is built and it's tested and you know whether or not it works. And that can be, you know, feedback from a set of unit tests. It can be feedback from just a tester on your staging environment. But, you know, continuous integration is all about, I made a commit and let's run the unit test on those. Let's deploy that to the staging environment. Let's, use some, a JS lint, var scope, or whatever other, scanning tools you want to run. And let's automate it so it's not a manual process, as opposed to saying, oh, I need to push that code to stage and it's so much work, I'll wait till Friday to do it. It should just happen. There's no reason why your code can't be on your staging server within, 5 minutes of you committing it without you lifting a finger.
And already had all the unit tests pass as well.
Yeah, because if the unit tests don't pass, it shouldn't be deployed. The build should be failed, and you should be notified. Because why have a human bother testing your code when your unit tests have already told you that they're failing now? So,
yeah,
it's all about automating, reducing those feedback cycles.
Yeah, improving code quality. Well, let's go on to the salary question, which I think we managed to. We got some interesting numbers here, but really,
yeah, we screwed this one up.
We need to extend the. Yeah, we screwed this up. So,
yeah, so we
didn't have enough possible answers.
What ColdFusion developers make. So next year we need to bump this baby up to like $1 million, I guess, to
there you
to
go.
Get better data.
So most people, nearly half the people were making more than 95K a year, and then there was a pretty even distribution all the way down to 25K, which I hope was on a kind of intern hobby level.
There's a couple unpaid, but I think this is great news for ColdFusion developers. If someone's considering, should I, develop in ColdFusion, I think this goes along with the other question that said it's difficult to find ColdFusion developers, right? So I said, it's a market to be hired in. So people are willing to pay to try to get people to come be a ColdFusion developer. And so I think this is good news for people with ColdFusion skills. And so hopefully next year we'll distribute the answers a bit higher up in the range to get some better data.
Yeah. So let's move on to those controversial security questions.
Yes.
Question 35, how do you lock down your servers for security? Check all apply. So most popular answer.
We need to shoot the 17 people that said none. What security?
Yeah. Well, people, you say shoot them. They aren't alone. The people who took this survey tend to be the most clued in ColdFusion developers who are on forums or on the Slack channel. The people who just do a regular 9-to-5 job, I bet you it's more than 3.8% don't do anything for security. I know it's the case because I've talked with some of them.
Yeah. So I think the official lockdown guide is great. Pete Freitag again helps write those. He's the author of FuseGuard and the hackmycf.com. A lot of people just don't even know those exist. They're freely available PDFs that literally give you screenshot, step-by-step, Apache, IIS, you name it, everything you need to do to lock down. And if everybody followed just the off-the-shelf lockdown guides, majority of ColdFusion hacks, if everybody followed the guides and updated their server to recent updates, the majority of ColdFusion hacks wouldn't even happen in the first place.
Yeah, and that recent updates has two parts. One is the hot fixes that Adobe or Lucy put out when a hack is discovered, and they quickly put out something. And they both do a great job of that. They don't cover up that there's been a hack. They put out that hot fix and send out an alert.
Yeah, the transparency sometimes it kind of feels like it can hurt the image. Because every time Adobe gets it's a security exploit, which isn't very often, to be honest, it's very highly publicized. But that's good because you want people to know about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the secure profile is another good one. I think more people need to be using that. Now, it's possible that not enough people are on the newer versions of ColdFusion that have the secure profile.
Yeah, and I was going to say there are two parts to this. First of all, you want to get the hot fixes as they come out, and HackMyCF will alert you to that by email. But the other thing is you need to get off end-of-life ColdFusion, which means CF9 or earlier, and CF10 is going to go end-of-life.
CF10 is really soon, yeah. So, ColdFusion 11, 2016, both have the secure profile. And when you install ColdFusion, it asks you, is this a production server? So many people forget just the obvious stuff like a custom error template, for their site. They're outputting all sorts of, juicy information for hackers and looking like noobs at the same time. And, secure profile sets a whole handful of settings just right off the bat that will make your server twice as secure. And also in ColdFusion 2016, let's say you're using it behind IIS, one of the most common installations. They've now blocked access to the entire CFIDE folder by default. You can't even get to it. The IIS connector won't even hit it, which, I mean, they should have done years ago. But I like these secure by default things. It makes using it slightly more complicated. You got to hit it directly through Tomcat, but in my opinion, those things are way worth it. Because ColdFusion installs back in the day just weren't secure by default, and most people didn't lock them down.
So let's go on to the what happens if you don't have things secure. So next question 36. Have your ColdFusion servers suffered from a hacking exploit in the last 2 years due to a CF-based vector? And this was an anonymous question. So yes. I'm glad to say 90% of people haven't had this, but that meant 10% of people have been hacked, which is upsetting, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, overall, I'm very glad to see, a lot of no's. I'll hear a lot from pen testers and people in the community that are not ColdFusion developers. They widely regard ColdFusion as just a very insecure platform. Any ColdFusion server is just immediately hackable. There's and that's not the case statistically. ColdFusion has a very low number of exploits, and I think this is a good graph. So I was very interested to see, out of the people who were hacked, what was the reason. And so, the most answered one is lack of ColdFusion patching, which isn't that surprising. And it's sad because that's one of the easiest ones to do. In ColdFusion now, you can even configure it to literally email you when new patches come out. I mean, you'll get an email in your inbox that says, here's an update. And people who just don't patch it, 4% of people who were hacked, or not 4% of people who were hacked, 4% of people who answered the question were hacked because they simply didn't install the updates. So
yeah, and then other SQL injection, cross-site scripting, like that thing you mentioned earlier where the admin is publicly available, other vulnerabilities in the code.
In the public administrator, also incredibly easy to lock down. A lot of people just don't do it. The only people I can really feel sorry for is a very small, less than 2%, that say they were actually hacked by an actual unpatched 0-day in the engine itself. And Adobe usually has patches available within 2 weeks or less when a 0-day has come out in the past. So that's usually a very small window. The remaining people who get hacked just simply don't apply the updates.
To be honest, when I've looked at hacks that have happened against ColdFusion, it's not day zero stuff. It's stuff that's been out for 6 months, a year, even longer. Or they're using CF9, which doesn't receive hot fixes anymore because it went end of life.
Yeah.
And you're never going to get hot fixes for that. And
every
people
company
just have holes in their setup.
Sure. In my opinion, every company, especially companies that have a segregated wall between developers and the DevOps guy that do the servers, they've got to have at least one person at the company whose responsibility it is to keep on updates, whether it's Windows updates or Linux updates, Apache updates, or ColdFusion updates. Somebody's got to, have a schedule where they go through and they check them all on a regular basis. It's the people who deploy a server and just leave it out there for years, that they get hammered on this.
And there's one other thing I'd say on this. The question said, have you, do you know you've had a hacking exploit? I have to tell you, when we've gone in and helped people who've been hacked, several of them they were hacked. The hack, when we dug into how did they get in and how long's this been going on, they were hacked like 6 months earlier. And it's only when the hackers started uploading wares or pornography or whatever on their server and they blew out the disk space, then and the server started crashing, then they understood they'd been hacked. But and that's actually very common. There've been some famous hackings. I don't think it was North Carolina or South Carolina state government, but one of those Carolinas, they were hacked like 6 months previously, and it took them that long to even discover. So I just want to, if people are sitting there thinking, oh yeah, I haven't been hacked, that may not be true.
It's entirely possible. And there are some good softwares out there, like Tripwire, that will try to detect malicious activity to notify you immediately if it looks like something's going on your server.
Yeah. So I definitely recommend that. Let me just... All right. So moving on. Next question. ColdFusion communities. So these are online communities. Question 37. Online communities that you're part of. And most popular one is the Slack channel, which last time I checked was a few thousand people in it. So very active.
Let's see here. I look right now. ColdFusion Slack. 1,972 people currently in it. So right under 2,000.
Wow. And you know, that's a great place to share useful information or to get answers to questions. So, and then second one here, you know, there's some framework specific ones. And then there's also some Facebook groups that are pretty popular. So,
yeah, I mean, overall, I think there's probably a lot of people who aren't in communities, but those are the kind of people who didn't take the survey because they weren't in the communities to know about the survey in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, typically people either heard about it through one of these communities by other people sharing it there, or they were on the Teretic email list. Or I think, I don't know if this happened on this year, but previous years, I know Integral sent out an email to their email list as well. Or maybe they saw a tweet on it. There were quite a few tweets as well, which we regarded as a community, because if you use the ColdFusion or CFML hashtag, it's going to pick up traffic.
Mm-hmm. All right, I've got a few minutes left on this end, so let's.
Yes, we're nearly at the end. So professional development time versus hobby time. Most people taking this are focused on professional time, and then hobby time. So that's open source projects or your own thing. Not so many people doing that.
So it seems that most people doing CF professionally is kind of mostly what they focus on, but a lot of people doing CF in their hobby appear to focus on a lot of other languages in their hobby time, which is not a bad thing.
Yeah. And then how do people work? Are they salaried, contract, self-employed? So most people taking the survey were salaried, but fair chunk contract or got their own business.
I think a lot of the people who are self-employed probably also were contractors. They probably, contract for themselves.
Yep. And then surprised that only 14% are remote. So
yeah, there's a lot more people that would probably work remote if there were positions available.
And then very few are unemployed, which relates to that high demand for ColdFusion developers. And then hardly anyone said they were a student, which I'd love to see that change, because that's how we get fresh blood.
I would too. Yeah, that's exactly where I started ColdFusion as a student. So I agree with you there.
And then we're at the final question, so which is any additional comments, and there were a lot of write-in comments. So maybe we're not going to scroll through all of those. If people are interested, they can do that. But perhaps we can just highlight some ones that really caught your eye. And I'm just going to see if I can stop the screen share so we can scroll down through those comments. And so let's look at 3 top themes that called out to us from these comments, Brad.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest ones are just people looking for, better support for ColdFusion and just marketing. And I think there's always, more that Lucy and Adobe can do in marketing. But I think, Adobe or Lucy can never do the same kind of marketing that you and I can do, just as developers from a grassroots perspective, being a part of user, going to conferences.
Isn't that what every open source language that competes with ColdFusion does?
Yeah, there's a lot of languages that don't have a corporate entity to market for them. They were grown up out of just masses of people saying, hey, I'm working on this really cool language called blah, take a look at it. And that's how they grew the community. So I think that's something that everybody can do, for sure, to help that on their own.
And we've got another number of people here who said they either love ColdFusion or bring CFML to the masses. Mm-hmm. So a lot of enthusiasm about ColdFusion. I noticed that in a number of the write-in comments.
Yes, as well. Yeah, I'm seeing several mentions of Lucy, people being excited about that.
So maybe we just need to tie those 2 things together, the people who are really enthusiastic about ColdFusion and the people who wish it was marketed better, and get that message out that it's a wonderful language and something to be proud of doing.
Yeah, I think, ways people can do that can involve finding a local user group, you know, even maybe just an open source user group or, a generic programming user group, and just being a part of it and, just talking about ColdFusion or, going to a conference, a local conference that's not a ColdFusion conference, and talking to people about what you do.
Or starting a meetup if there isn't one. They're very easy to start.
Yeah, I mean, if you've
Get
got a town
folks together.
with enough ColdFusion developers, you can talk with Alicia DeVork from Adobe, and try to even start an official Adobe meetup, ColdFusion, or it doesn't have to be official. It can just be you inviting people to talk about the cool stuff that's going on.
And for people who don't have other people in town, the Southern Florida ColdFusion User Group went virtual a few years back, and anyone can attend their meetings.
That's nice. Can't say his name. Charlie Earhart also has the online CF meetup, and they don't meet on a regular basis, but as needed when he has speakers. And that's a group you can do online as well.
Yeah, so lots of resources. The Southern ColdFusion one, I think, has a roundtable format where people bring the coding problem they have. So they don't have a speaker unless one turns up, but they do meet every month, I believe. And that's run by Gian Carlos Gomez, who I interviewed for the podcast the other day.
Yeah, JC is a cool guy.
Yeah. All right. So that's it for another ColdFusion State of the Union survey 2017. Thank you, Brad, for your great commentary. And looking forward to what's going to change next year in this.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael.